This is a continuation of the series on U.S. foreign policy, and today I'm going to begin with the creation of the OSS, or the Office of Strategic Services, by President Franklin D. Roosevelt during World War II. The OSS, or the Office of Strategic Services, was formed as an agency of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to coordinate espionage activities behind enemy lines for all branches of the United States Armed Forces during World War II. Other OSS functions included the use of propaganda, subversion, and post-war planning. The first director of the OSS was William Donovan. The OSS was disbanded on September 20th, 1945, and then in 1947, the National Security Act was passed by Congress, and that led to the formation of the National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA as it is known today. President Truman created a loose body called the Central Intelligence Group in 1946 to advise him on intelligence matters. Truman did not, however, give this group the authority to carry out covert secret operations. Allen Dulles argued that this should change. The Office of Strategic Services was populated by lawyers and investment bankers that were chosen by President FDR, and of course this morphed into the CIA after World War II. By the end of World War II, the OSS had started to shift their operations against the Soviet Union, even though the Soviet Union was a U.S. ally during World War II. The new agency, CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency, would be not only an intelligence organization, but it would be authorized to engage in covert operations later on against all communists and persons engaged in subversion against the U.S. or its allies. So on July 26, 1947, President Truman signed into law the National Security Act. This created the National Security Council to advise the president on foreign policy, and it also created a Central Intelligence Agency that was authorized to collect information and to act on it. That leads us to the relationship between this man, Major General Karl Wolf, and Allen Dulles. And Allen Dulles, of course, will become the first director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So we need to look at who this Major General Karl Wolf was. He was a high-ranking SS member. He was the chief of staff for Heinrich Himmler. Wolf facilitated the providing of slave labor from the concentration camps to the major corporations in Germany. Allen Dulles, in the State Department in Germany, intervened on Karl Wolf's behalf and sent a team of people to save Wolf, who was surrounded by partisans in Italy in 1945. And John J. McCloy also played a major role in the commutation of sentences of Nazi war criminals. So remember that name also, John J. McCloy. Members of the elite provided assistance to high-ranking members of the Third Reich from the government and the SS in fleeing Europe to avoid trial for war crimes. Hundreds of these were charged for running concentration camps, and show trials were being planned to reveal how slavery was used by the owners and managers of corporations during the war. Men inside the OSS moved to assist high-ranking Nazi and SS officials so that they would be able to work with the elite against communists after the war. They organized an underground railroad out of Europe, and this was called the Odessa. Those who were fleeing on this underground railroad were provided with false identities and hidden, some in monasteries and with the cooperation of the Catholic Church. They were smuggled out between 1943 and 1945, and they were taken in ships and submarines to Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Peru, Paraguay, and Chile. OSS officials also struck a deal with a high Nazi official named Major General Reinhard Gehlen. By the end of the war, Gehlen knew the war was lost, but he and 7 of his men thought it could be viewed as just one battle in the much longer war for fascism. They microfilmed the files that had been compiled on anti-Soviet activities and all of the names and addresses of all of their agents, along with their code names. They hid the files in 7 barrels, big 50-gallon drums, and transported them to the Bavarian mountains in Obergammergau in a huge trench that they dug. The files sat there for the remainder of the war. When the German army surrendered to the Americans, Galen came out of the Bavarian mountains dressed in the uniform of an American private and turned himself in to the 101st Counter-Intelligence Corps of the U.S. Army. Galen revealed who he was and offered, if they would release him and 100 of his men in the anti-Soviet division, to turn himself in and work for them. In return, their names would be taken off the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. Galen was put in charge of the post-war intelligence post in Germany. Galen was assigned 2 German-American translators from the 101st Intelligence Corps. These men were Theodore D. Shackley and Henry Kissinger. They served as translators in the initial offer Galen made to the OSS. Galen then went with Shackley to the U.S., where he spent 3 weeks negotiating with the top officials of the OSS and elite bankers and lawyers for the elite, making a bargain that he would run the anti-Soviet intelligence division for the Allied powers after World War II. And in return, of course, they would take Galen and 100 of his men off the Nuremberg list and put them in charge of the new intelligence agency that was to be set up in the western half of Germany. Operation Overcast was an aggressive campaign to identify and seek out all of the Third Reich's anti-communist agents everywhere. Many of these were fascist Nazis who were brought into the OSS and deputized as political operatives of the anti-communist campaign the OSS was planning to mount in Europe. The deputies were given protection and taken into the protective custody of the OSS. They were given new names, false passports, and put into the positions all over Europe. This is above and beyond those who escaped to South America. The group was called the Gladios, for the Latin root of the sword. These men were put in place by the OSS in Europe, allowed to run for offices as mayors, town council people. They were put into local businesses, all the while disguising their former Nazi connections and membership. The Italian branch of these stay-behind cells and groups was called Operation Gladio. Operation Gladio became famous when the Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti talked about it. Gladio involved Freemasons, Mafia members, and the Vatican, who all united with the CIA and NATO in a holy war against communism. Operation Gladio was responsible for some horrible atrocities and false flag attacks in Italy, such as the bombing of a train station in 1980, and these were then blamed on the communists. Operation Paperclip. The OSS also undertook a program to get all of the rocket scientists out of Germany after the war so they would not go over to the Soviets. The Germans had an aggressive program of rocket development and missiles during World War II. In a highly classified program of the OSS called Operation Paperclip, German rocket scientists were recruited and brought to the United States. Roughly 1,600 scientists were recruited. Operation Paperclip got its name from the paperclips that were attached to the files of applicants filing for U.S. immigration permits. President Truman sanctioned the operation, but forbade the recruitment of Nazi or SS members. Officials in the OSS simply bypassed this by whitewashing the incriminating evidence against the scientists. This means that the true identities of the scientists and doctors who were recruited were hidden so that no one would know their connections to the Nazi Party in Germany, Hitler, or other high-level members of the Third Reich during World War II. As World War II was ending, the race was on with the Soviet Union to seize as many German scientists as possible in anticipation of the Cold War. The US, USSR, Britain, and France were all interested in recruiting German scientists and making use of the technology that this group developed during World War II. One of the areas of greatest interest was in the German program to develop the V-2 rocket. Werner von Braun was born in Germany in 1912. He was an aerospace engineer and later a space architect. Von Braun was one of the scientists brought over to the U.S. under Operation Paperclip. He developed the German V-2 rocket. German technology, of course, was way ahead of American technology during World War II. And during World War II, von Braun worked at a facility in Germany known as Nordhausen. This was an underground tunnel facility where scientists worked to build V-2 rockets for the Third Reich. Von Braun and Arthur Rudolph were in charge of this operation, and during the time they oversaw the project, 30,000 slave laborers died building the V-2 rockets. Von Braun would often visit the concentration camps and handpick the laborers. Werner von Braun became the first director of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, in the United States on July 1st, 1960. He held the position until January 27, 1970. During the Gerald Ford administration, 1974 to 1977, von Braun was almost awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom until one of Ford's senior advisors objected to his Nazi past. Annie Jacobsen is an investigative journalist who has written a book called Operation Paperclip. She's an investigative journalist who has written about Operation Paperclip, and she's also written books called Area 51. She's written a book called The Pentagon's Brain about the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. She's also written books called Phenomena about the CIA's investigation into ESP and psychokinesis, and recently Surprise and Vanish about CIA paramilitary armies and assassins. After the 1930s, while the Japanese Imperial Army looted Southeast Asia, Emperor Hirohito launched the Golden Lily operation aimed at recovering and hiding his war booty, which was a stockpile of silver, gold, platinum, jewels, and artifacts. This represented tens of billions of dollars of value. For example, all the gold was taken out of the banks in Hong Kong and Singapore. The treasure was hidden in the Philippines and buried in 176 separate troves. Hundreds of huge caverns were dug to hide it when the Japanese feared invasion by the U.S. at the end of the war. A special Allied force was sent in to look for the treasure after the bombing and surrender of Japan. Edward Lansdale, OSS officer in the Philippines, took custody of the Japanese General Yamashita, along with his driver, who was, unfortunately, tortured. The driver, under torture, revealed the whereabouts of about 12 sites of treasure. The first site yielded $1 billion worth of loot. Lansdale flew to Singapore to meet General MacArthur, and from there they went to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Truman. Truman immediately brought in Secretary of War Stimson and his 3 assistants, Robert Lovett, Robert Anderson, and John J. McCloy. A decision was made that the 12 troves, which totaled $1.2 trillion, was to be concealed from the American people, Congress, and the rest of the government, and put into the hands of the 3 assistant secretaries of war, Lovett, Anderson, and McCloy. 2 of the 3 were partners in, you guessed it, Brown Brothers Harriman investment firm. The $1.2 trillion became a trust called the Anderson Trust or Black Eagle Trust. The money was shipped out secretly using U.S. military aircraft to banks in Switzerland and put into unmarked accounts. The trust was used to finance the election of fascists to mayor's offices and city councils all through Europe, and to oppose the elections of people who might be sympathetic to socialism because they were anti-fascists. The end game? To finance the struggle against communism. These funds became an important part of the elite group's secret power during the post-World War II period. Harry Rositzke wrote a book called CIA's Secret Operations. And looking back on the time period of the Cold War, which was launched after World War II, he wrote, "The world was divided into 2 parts, communist and free. All countries were either good or bad. Those who did not take sides were bad. The Cold War became a war against the infidels, a defense of free, God-fearing men against the atheist communist system. There was no serious dissent from this view for a decade. The White House, the Secretaries of State of both parties of Congress, the press, and the reading public all viewed the communist threat through the same prism. It was the last great consensus in America on our foreign purposes. As it turned out, the image was an illusion. it was our almost total ignorance of what was going on in the denied area behind the Iron Curtain that helped to create the false image of a super powerful Soviet Union. And in another video, I'm going to talk about Professor Anthony Sutton's book, National Suicide, which reveals the hypocrisy behind the all super powerful Soviet Union, which was pretty much built with Western technology, the Western world, and the United States. So all of this was set up because there had to be an enemy created, and the enemy had to be fought. And of course, that contributes to a very powerful military-industrial complex and a very powerful military and lots of weapons production. And so the whole image of the Cold War in a lot of ways was a farce. And if you read books that are suppressed and they're not the official textbook narrative, you'll find out that the Cold War worldview was in large part manufactured for a purpose. So this is General Lucius Clay. He was the Allied commander in Europe, and he sent a warning in 1948 that the Soviet Union might attack with dramatic suddenness. American leaders in Congress, of course, reacted with near hysteria. And on June 18, 1948, the year-old National Security Council reacted by issuing a secret directive called NSC 10/2, which President Truman approved. This gave the CIA more explicit power than it ever had. And this is a copy, the only one I could find, of the U.S. government directive. It's rather difficult to read. It's kind of blurry, but I'm going to read for you what it says. It says, a new Office of Special Projects shall be created within the Central Intelligence Agency to plan and conduct covert operations. As used in this directive, covert operations are understood to be all activities, except as noted herein, which are conducted or sponsored by this government against hostile foreign states or groups in support of friendly foreign states or groups, but which are so planned and executed that any U.S. government responsibility for them is not evident to unauthorized persons, and that if uncovered, the U.S. government can plausibly disclaim any responsibility for them. And in the next segment of the series, I'm going to talk about some other consequences of Operation Paperclip that ended up being quite heinous, and that is the bringing over to the United States not just the Nazi scientists to form NASA, but a group of doctors who ended up creating the infamous and heinous MK-Ultra mind control program in the United States. So see you next time.